Welcome to Godsplaining, Contemplative Preachers, Contemporary Age. Each week, join the Dominican friars as they consider all things Catholic.
Welcome to Godsplaining. This is Father Jacob Bertrand Janczyk, and today on this episode, I am joined by Father Bonaventure Chapman. Hi, Father
Here I am.
Bonaventure. There he is. How you doing?
Doing great, Father Jacob Bertrand. How are you doing?
Oh, the best. Yeah, no, I really like when we don't record. We're not on episodes terribly often together. Just the way it kind of
You never let me. Yeah, I know. It's incredible.
No, that's actually the true thing, that I just don't want to be on episodes with Father Bonaventure. But my favorite thing about being on episodes with Father Bonaventure is that even though we've been doing this podcast for over a year and a half, not quite 2 years, but over a year and a half. And even though Father Bonaventure and I live in the same house, we still don't have the wherewithal or the know-how to record in the same room. So we're both sitting in our respective places to record this. So
Father Jacob Bertrand is in his office, and I am in his room. No,
that's not true.
That's not true. Yeah, that's true. Well, we did used to record sometimes together, and we'd sit around like a coffee table or something. It was kind of bizarre, but this is better. And your office is much nicer looking than any other place in this priory.
Yeah.
So I get to visit it when we do these episodes, so that's always exciting for me. Not only getting to see you, but your beautiful office.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
I appreciate that. Yeah. Well, here we are in the fifth week of Lent already. Is that right? Does that mean that Holy Week is just 3 days away?
Palm Sunday is coming up, where maybe we'll get things this year. And although it seems like this is the long Lent, so it seems like this has been Lent since last year, basically.
Yeah, that's kind of true.
But we're getting, resurrection's coming. Vaccines are here. There's, rumors. There's rumors of potential new life. So it's kind of like the first century all over again. I imagine it felt just like this.
Yeah, that might be true. Perhaps. I don't know. I wasn't there, so I can neither confirm nor deny. But in any case, What I can confirm is that it is the fifth week of Lent, and we are just days away from Holy Week. And if you have been following the podcast at all, you will know that through Lent, we've been running a sort of series called Back to Virtue on the virtues, walking through the virtues. So even because, it doesn't fit neatly, we started the week before Lent with the virtue of faith and worked through the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love, or charity, I think is more appropriate, perhaps for the virtues. And now we are working through the cardinal, or the cardinal virtues. Or the moral virtues.
Moral virtues, natural virtue, yeah.
Very quickly. So this week's episode on Temperance is the penultimate episode. So the previous two episodes with Justice and Prudence, I think in that order, maybe in the other order, and then next week will be the last on Fortitude. So if you are looking to brush up on your virtues, you've tuned into the right episode at least, and then you could work backwards if you want.
And Father Jacob Bertrand, why would someone want to brush up on their virtues?
That's a great question. I don't know. Well, virtues are just things that Dominicans talk about, right? So that's
exactly.
But no, that is a good question, because often I think the worst kind of answers are answers to questions that haven't been asked. So if we're just talking about virtue and we don't talk about, why? Well, we probably talked about why in other places, but because this episode is part of a series on virtues, let's talk about virtue for just a moment to get us situated, to get us oriented. So if you haven't tuned in or don't remember virtues, the virtues are important to the Christian life, because the virtues are those tools or the means by which a Christian is perfected or reaches perfection, of course, by the grace of God. It is the way, the virtues are sort of the dispositions or the qualities of a soul, we would say, that allow us to pursue the good. And ultimately, what is more, it's not just about being able to do things, because in a sense, who cares if you can do this or that thing? But the virtues are really an imitation of Christ. It is the way in which the Christian pursues the Christian life. It's the way in which the Christian pursues Christ. Christ had the fullness of the virtues in his humanity, in his person, and in that we are given the grace, hopefully, certainly through the sacraments, but also through our cooperation with grace to live the virtuous life. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it's right. Virtues are like modes of existence, but existing well. Father Jacob Bertrand talked about the powers of the soul in a way, and we all have particular powers to be able to speak and walk and run and talk and do things. But to do them well, it needs to have training and the right dispositions, and the virtues are doing that. So just like when you have a dog and the dog doesn't really know how to catch initially and kind of drops balls and doesn't pick it up right, it gets trained until it gets sort of habitus, you could say, and has the virtue to fetch well. And that's what we all want, to live well and exist well. And as he said, talk about existing like Christ. And the virtues, they help us to do that. So it's good to brush up on them in a way, and to bring them to consciousness so that we can explicitly aim at them. Because unlike dogs, we have rational powers so that we can actually act upon ideas and thoughts.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think that, Father Bonaventure, you mentioned the word habitus, or just that's the Latin for the word habit. And I think in talking about the virtues in the moral life, sometimes using the Latin word, the habitus, is better, because when we talk about habits with respect to virtues and vices, we're not talking about a habit as we usually think, this sort of rote, unthinking response to something, the Pavlovian kind of experiment where, you ring a bell, you don't ring a dog, where you
ring a dog and a bell comes. Yeah.
Yeah, and the dog salivates just out of a habit. What we're talking about here, because we are rational beings, is that our actions contribute to who we are and to what we do. So somebody is on the bad side of things, same thing with vices. On the bad side of things, a liar is a liar because he lies. But someone is a prudent person is prudent because he practices prudence. And all of this is infused by grace. But before this episode is on the virtue of temperance, but before we dive into that, let's take a step back and situate temperance within the grand scheme of the virtues. So classically, the virtues are divided into two groups: the theological and then the moral, or the cardinal virtues. Tell us about the theological virtues, just by way of quick summary.
Sure. Quick summary. So the theological virtues are the virtues, as you can imagine, to do with God, and so their object is God. They aim at God, so our relationship with God, and they do in particular ways. So faith is, in a sense, the first theological virtue. It's our intellect's good acting or good thinking or good directions, the habitus of thinking well about God and divine things. So that's what faith is, a gift to do that. And these are supernatural ones, so we receive them as gifts and develop them in terms of grace as we participate and cooperate with God's gift to us. That's why sin is so important to remove from your life, because you can't cooperate with the graces to live well in these ways in faith. And in hope is the second one, which is the virtue of willing well for yourself, so willing the eternal good for yourself, so overcoming different vices and things that would keep you from eternal life. And then charity or love is, again, the second one for the will. The will gets two, because the will is super important. And it's willing the good for the good's sake. So willing God as your end, not just for you, which is for hope is for your eternal life, but for loving God. It's like the inverse of, in confession, we talk about imperfect and perfect contrition. So we say, I'm sorry for my sins because of punishment, but really I'm sorry because they offend you, God, who are all good and deserving of love. Theological virtues are like the antidotes to that. Hope is, I'm sorry, I want to love you for heaven. And then charity is, I want to love you for you, because you are worthy of love, and you're like God, as in the sense of like a beautiful painting that just deserves to be appreciated and viewed for its own sake, not because it gets you anything from that.
Right. So the theological virtues, as Father Bonaventure broke them down, orient us to God. The object, we would say, what they're aimed at is God himself. Now, the moral virtues, of which temperance is one of the four principal moral virtues, those direct our actions towards the good, to those things that are means to holiness. So if you want to know more about prudence and justice, tune into the last 2 weeks' episodes, last Thursday and the Thursday before. They cover those. And if you want to know about fortitude, then you can listen to next week's episode. You should still listen to this one, but we're going to talk about temperance today. So temperance is one of those four moral virtues. And temperance, we could define temperance in this way, that temperance, the virtue of temperance, is a supernatural habit. Remember, we're still talking in the world of grace here, that God gives us the grace to live this way. So a supernatural habit that moderates the inclination to sense pleasures, and keeps them within the limits of reason, illumined by faith. So a couple
what
things.
What a mouthful.
But it's a good definition.
You did a great job.
Well, it's not my definition. I didn't come up with it. It's the definition. It's a definition.
Okay. All right, good.
So I think it's a helpful definition because it covers all of the points that we've been talking about in this series. So it's supernatural, right? Given by, aided by grace, given to us by God in grace. It's a habit. It's something that we build over time by cooperating with grace. But it is the virtue, we could say, of moderation. It moderates our inclination to food, drink, and sex. To food, drink, and sex, to those sense pleasures, and it keeps them within the limits of reason. And that within the limits of reason is super important. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And this is a really Thomistic kind of point in the moral kind of moral virtues and the moral and Christian moral life. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. So. Okay, definition. How does this play out? How does temperance at least generally play out then? What's the purpose of it in a more practical way, Father Bonaventure?
These are the interesting ones because faith, hope, and love, or charity, and then prudence is about the reason, in a sense, practical reason, and then justice is about the will and willing the good, and those are kind of all spiritual. They're related to spiritual things. So angels, you could, like, a rational soul kind of has this thing, but temperance and fortitude are kind of like the animal supernatural virtues because they have to do with, as you heard, sense pleasures for temperance. You could talk about like the base passions. I mean, the vision of, and this is the Thomistic aspect Father Jacob Bertrand was bringing up, is St. Thomas and the Catholic Church, of course, in general, doesn't run away from sense pleasures or the world, but rather draws the world up by grace into a reasonable discourse and reasonable action. And temperance is aimed at those sense appetites, we could say. So the appetites that we have and share with animals. And those appetites are described in particular ways. So what would you want to do with that? How do you want to describe the appetites?
Yeah.
I have to say, this is Father Jacob Bertrand did his Tessina on these sort of things. His you could say his master's thesis in a way. So I know he'll have some excellent things to say about this as well. So
dangerous.
What are appetites now?
Yeah, that's a great question, and also another one of those kind of things that get lost in translation, like the word habit and habitus. So in a sense, it's related to what you would think of as an appetite, something that we have a desire for. I have an appetite for burgers and beer. That's a weird way to say that I want to eat that, but you know what I mean. When we look at the soul, so to take a step back, when we look at the human person, this is coming from Aristotle and through Thomas Aquinas and other thinkers too, but we can identify, as Father Bonaventure made mention earlier, powers of the soul. And all that means is that we can look at what the thing does and then say from what it does, well, then it has the ability to do that. So let's look at the human person, for example. Humans grow. Human beings grow, as do animals and plants. So traditionally, this part of the soul, the soul that gives the living being the power to grow, is typically referred to as the vegetative soul. It just allows the thing to grow. So we have that power. We could say more about it, but it's not necessary. The second kind of level or power would be the sensitive soul. Not that like, oh, I'm sensitive, I cry at movies, but the sensitive, so that there are senses that react to external objects. So classically here, think of the five senses. But there are more than just those five senses. There are intellectual senses, and then we have the two appetites that I'm setting aside for a second that we'll talk about. And then the third power, the third soul of the person, right? So we have vegetative, sensitive. The third we're also probably familiar with, but just not under this terminology, but the rational part of the soul, our ability to know and love. So we know that these powers of the soul exist because we can reason and we could will things, we could love things. So we can just talk about, when we talk about parts of the soul, there's one soul, but the soul enables the person or the living being to do multiple things. So if we're looking at the sensitive soul, let's say a word about these appetites. We can talk about two different appetites here in the person that are important for this discussion on virtue. The first is the concupiscible appetite, or we'll start with the irascible. The first is the irascible appetite. And the irascible appetite is simply the person's response to something that is arduous, something that is difficult to get or to avoid. So when we sense something, when we perceive something as good but difficult to get, that our irascible appetite responds to that. So if I want to get in as an undergraduate, I wanted to be a doctor. If I want to get into medical school, I know the steps that I need to take as an undergraduate, studying good grades, MCATs, et cetera, et cetera. It's a possible good for me to attain, but a difficult one. So here, the virtue of fortitude comes in to allow us to persevere. We're going to leave that for now, because fortitude's the topic of next week's episode. The other is called the concupiscible appetite, similar to the irascible, but the concupiscible appetite responds to those things that are either good things that are easy to get, or good or bad things that are easy to avoid. So the difference there is between easy and not so easy. And this is the subject of temperance. So we can think of food. Typically, food is something, I desire, I can get it pretty easily. There's, typically. Same thing with a drink of water. There's an immediate response, or bad food, there's an immediate aversion. And temperance is that virtue that moderates our response to these appetites, to these desires. So with that, why don't we take a break? Let's process that for a minute. Keep in mind that we're talking about temperance, the concupiscible appetite. We've dug in a little bit, and now we're going to climb back out now that we've sort of done the work to kind of understand what's going on. So hang tight. We're going to take a break, and when we return, we'll talk about temperance with respect to living the Christian life. We'll be right back.
You are listening to Godsplaining. Visit us at godsplaining.org to listen to our episodes, shop our store, and donate to our podcast. All gifts go to improving the podcast and bringing the gospel to more listeners. Thanks for your support.
Welcome back to Godsplaining. I'm Father Jacob Bertrand, and I'm here with Father Bonaventure. And in the first half of the episode, we were kind of reviewing our virtues in this series of Back to Virtue, and then diving into the weeds a bit on this temperance, on the virtue of temperance, which it might be a little bit of a slog, but really sets up what we're going to talk about now, and also what for next week's episode on fortitude. So, Father Bonaventure, we talked about these appetites, the concupiscible appetite. How would you sort of give a sort of, I don't know, I don't like this phrase, elevator summary, but like bring that into focus for us, what we've been talking about with respect to the person, I guess.
Of course. So the concupiscible appetites involves concupiscence, and you might have heard this. So these are all jargon terms here, but you're probably familiar with something about concupiscence as, well, inclinations, and oftentimes sinful inclinations. We have this language of concupiscence, in a sense, the leftover remnants of original sin, kind of draw us to sense pleasures that we oughtn't not to be drawn to. So we talked about these basic powers here that we share with animals, wanting food and drink and reproduction, this kind of thing. But because, the fall, and because we're sinful, we don't or shouldn't trust all the time these inclinations that we have. Like, they could be drawn to, in general, we drawn to good things like food, but we might be drawn to it too much. We might be drawn to eating too much food, or the wrong kind of food in the wrong way. Or we could be, in the same way, treat food improperly by eating too little. Right? We could be averting from it or something. And the same thing to do with sex as well. These are, in a sense, food and sex are the kind of basic platforms of human sin, because they're so basic to our natures in terms of nutrition and reproduction and the sense of being a human being in the natural sense. So temperance, although it initially seems like a kind of low-level virtue, not as interesting or important as justice and prudence or the theological virtues, is in a way kind of the foundation virtue for living towards the good. The fortitude, of course, is for the more difficult things, but if you don't get temperance right, if we're not good, temperate people, then it's harder to build in the other virtues because we're going to be distracted by our sense pleasures. So it's a crucial virtue to have. I suppose the other thing to mention that temperance, oftentimes we think of temperance as abstinence. You can confuse these two things with the Temperance League, and you think about the Progressive Era, 1930s, and all involved in that movement of prohibition. And so a temperate person we might initially think of, at least in a Protestant world, as someone who doesn't drink at all or doesn't have any fun, no dancing, no gambling, this kind of stuff. And the temperance under Catholic understanding is a virtue which is about doing things in the right way, at the right times, for the right reasons, the virtue of living in the mean to this. So the virtue of temperance is going to tell us how we are to enjoy the sensual pleasure of things, how we are going to enjoy food and sex in the right way and in a way that's befitting of godliness.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly the point to latch onto here is that often when we think about the virtues, and especially things that fall under the virtue of temperance, we often hear them in terms of negative commands, like don't drink too much, don't have sex before you get married, don't do this, don't, and like, yes, those are good things, but the reality is that the virtues, all of them, and temperance included, are less about what we ought not do and more about what a fully integrated, fulfilled, flourishing person does. So the temperate person knows how to live in right reason with respect to food, drink, and sex. And what is more is that in St. Thomas's language, that the person that we who live temperately respond to food, drink, and sex joyfully, promptly, and easily. We don't struggle in these areas when we live the fullness of virtue. And that's why when we begin to try to live a temperate life, there's struggle. We're not habituated. Remember, we're talking about habits here, so we might have contrary habits. But as grace works on us over time, and as we cooperate with grace, we become conformed to pursuing the good in such a way that it's joyful, easy, and we do so promptly. And so why don't we just list? So temperance is this sort of umbrella virtue here, but there are the sort of sub virtues of temperance that kind of identify some of these. So as Father Bonaventure was saying, abstinence is that sub virtue that moderates food. Sobriety, that sub virtue that moderates the way in which we drink or how we drink. Chastity moderates sexual pleasure and sexual interaction. Purity and modesty also fall under temperance. Purity moderates our sort of external actions that would perhaps lead or prepare one for sexual relationships or not. And modesty, especially with the way we dress, the way we present ourselves. So all of this has to do with as Father Bonaventure was saying, these base or common appetites or desires for food, drink, and sex, the things that we share with animals even. I don't know if you have anything to say about those, but I think they help to shed light. Okay, and what are we talking about? What are the actual things, that food, drink, sex, the big three?
And again, this is the being a human is not just like learning, being habituated to act well, but it's being habituated to act well through the use of reason. So all of these kind of distinctions that we make here with abstinence, sobriety, chastity, purity, and modesty, you think, oh, it's expanding things, but it's making our actions more precise. It's making it clearer so that we can actually, in a sense, target better. It's like having better GPS tracking. You can get closer and closer to what you actually need to fix to live and celebrate well. Because temperance, of course, is the virtue of celebrating. It's the virtue of how to celebrate well, how to rejoice at certain occasions, and how not to rejoice on other occasions. So it's for, as Father Jacob Bertrand said, positive things, because these are all goods. Food, sex, and drink are natural goods. And the virtue of temperance is the correction, both the natural and the supernatural level, of celebrating and aiming at those and achieving those goods well. And so abstinence, sobriety, chastity, purity, modesty, and you might think this is just getting cumbersome, but it actually means that you're learning how to speak better and more fluently, and that translates into acting better and more fluently. It's about being precise about how we interact as human beings with ourselves and with others. So they're good to have to distinguish between them, just like when you know a fluent writer, the difference between someone who's a third grade author and someone who's an actual novelist is the command of language. And these sub-virtues of temperance, getting down into them, gives us a better command of human action.
Right. Yeah. And I think that this better command is perhaps a good way to talk about this point, this rational, using how these things are incorporated into that higher power of the soul, the rational part of our soul. And this is something unique that we find in St. Thomas. And I think that when I first came across it, I found it to be something pretty astounding, and I don't think something that we hear all too often when we talk about the moral life, or especially the way that the church treats the moral life. And that St. Thomas gives the church this idea that these base or common or lower desires, food, drink, and sex, they actually contribute to our holiness when integrated into the person by grace. A phrase was coined that they become rational by participation. So these desires for food, drink, and sex, when aided and healed by grace, when as Father Bonaventure was talking, we act properly for these goods, they become incorporated or governed by our reason. So our reason dictates when it is good to participate in food, drink, and sex, and how and to what degree, and these kind of things. These contribute to our growth in holiness. So to kind of boil that down even more simply, like enjoying the company of your friends and enjoying a nice like a bourbon and like maybe a cigar or whatever. I mean, that's kind of sometimes what we do here, but I don't know what you like to enjoy or other things. That can actually make you holy. It can actually contribute to your holiness.
Yeah, and I think it's and through reason. I mean, we think that's how can you eat rationally and eat in a holy fashion? But anyone who has animals, like has a dog, for instance, and we talk about it's dinner time for the dog, and what does that mean? It means you throw a plate in front of a dog, and then they slam their head into the bowl and eat it as fast as possible, and then like spread water everywhere, right? And if we did that, like you could put a plate on the table and someone just slammed their head into it, you'd say you're not being rational, you're not being human, you're not being a good person, right? Even you get even moral about this sort of thing. This is an affront, and that's what. So our eating, in a very basic sense, like being at dinner, knowing manners, knowing how to have a conversation, knowing how to eat well and exist with people, is a rational thing. Like we as human beings do even these basic things rationally, and then with grace, of course, we do them for the glory of God in sense of living well and with others and supporting. This is where charity kind of comes in. All the virtues, of course, kind of mixed together and they build off each other. But it's that rational by participation is something that sounds strange at first, but once you see it and then you think about how animals do some of these things we do, but not anywhere near, almost in a sense of like they're not eating at all. They're just feeding. We're the ones who are eating. So that's how we kind of elevate first to rational and then to grace in this way. Then, of course, the higher powers like loving and knowing, those can be elevated in grace in a specific way, in a higher way, because we're not going to really, eating in heaven is not exactly obviously the same as it is so these don't have the same they have a ceiling to them, you could say, whereas knowing and loving don't have the same ceiling.
Yeah, I think that's right. So we've kind of, first half of the episode, dove in to the weeds a bit, and now I've kind of pulled out about with more things specific to temperance. So what, perhaps in the last few minutes, a few points about living the virtue of temperance. How do we do that? I think that one of the really important things in the Christian life and growth in the Christian life is to pray for the virtues and to pray for those virtues as the antidotes to the vices in our lives. So if we look at the church fathers and through even the desert fathers before and the church fathers, I guess at around the same time, and through the history of the church, the tradition of the church always seems to lump virtues and vices together. So classic example that, the remedy to pride is humility. So we pray, we have to first recognize where we are weak, where we're broken, where our vices may lie, where we tend to sin, but then to pray for the contrary virtues, because remember, they are grace, they're supernatural reality. So with respect to temperance, if difficulties with food, whether, as Father Bonaventure said, overeating, undereating is a problem, well, pray for that virtue of abstinence. If you find yourself going out too much and drinking too much, pray, maybe stop doing that. You can have a little self-control, but also pray for the virtue of sobriety. If issues with sexuality, with relationships, pray for the virtue of chastity. The Holy Spirit hears and responds. The other thing that I'll say here, and I'm sure Father Bonaventure has a couple ideas, but the other thing that I think is particularly united to growth in our relationship to food, drink, and sex, our growth in relationship to the virtue of temperance is penance. If you think about what we often do as Catholics for penance, it often revolves around food, drink, and sex. We give up food for Lent. We have all these kind of moderations around food and drink. The taming of the flesh. Remember, these are common or basic appetites that we share, the taming and the control of our bodily desires, controlled by what? Not just by like beating them down, but controlled by reason, to integrate them into the higher powers, is often done through a bit of penance and a bit of taming and a bit of control in that way. So Lent is kind of a perfect time. But I don't know. What do you think, Father Bonaventure?
Well, I would say again, bringing it up into grace. So again, temperance of itself isn't the highest virtue, but it certainly is a necessary one to live the life of grace indirectly, in the way that if you can't get your passions under control, and we're going to have fortitude next week, if you can't get these ones under control, you're not going to be able to get the rational, the reason, the will under control itself. So that even though these seem like they're low-hanging fruit, they're really important, and you can't just skip over them. We believe that grace builds on nature, and since we're human beings, we're made with bodies and souls as a unity, it matters what we do with our bodies for our souls. So it's not like we're ghosts and machines and it doesn't really matter because don't worry, we can always go to confession. But if you build in the wrong sensate aspects of your life, you're not satisfying the pleasures in the right way, then you're unlikely to go for the higher things of actually loving others, loving God, knowing others, knowing God in the same way. So sometimes aiming at these are actually, if you can get your sense pleasures ordered, you find that it's a lot easier to get your spiritual life in order as well, because you've in a sense removed hindrances from those graces of the rational aspects of your knowing and loving, since you're not fighting those in the sense realm. So while not directly applicable all the time to spiritual disciplines and spiritual practices of knowing and loving in God and others, they're indirectly crucial to being able to do those things. They're like when you learn an instrument, the scales, you don't want to play scales for the rest of your life and chords on the piano or something or in the guitar, but you need to know those things to be able to actually instantiate really beautiful music on them. They're crucial. And temperance is essential in that aspect.
All right. Well, I think we've kind of said our piece on temperance. I don't know. Any final last thoughts here, Father Bonaventure?
No, I think again, it's important that people see temperance. It's for a good and not a negative thing in terms of saying no to things. We again, to turn back to Christ, the imitatio Christi. Christ is not a naysayer. All things yes in Christ for him, but yes in the right way. And so when we try to live the virtuous life, even at the sense pleasures level, we're trying to live life. We're living, but living well. So it's important that it's not a negation saying you can't do these things, but rather you should do these things, which might exclude these other things. But always focus on living well and the positives of the holy life and not the negative part of it.
That's great. Excellent. Well, thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of Godsplaining. As we've said through the episode and at the top of the episode, this is the penultimate episode in our Back to Virtue Lenten series. So if you've missed some before, either on faith, hope, and charity, or prudence, justice, or you're looking forward to fortitude, those are all available on your normal podcast apps or websites or wherever people get podcasts from. So if you don't mind, when you're looking for those episodes, to give us a like, to share, comment, maybe share it with somebody who you think might benefit from listening to what we have to say. Also, thank you to those who are supporting the podcast through Patreon. If you'd like to become one of our donors, you can certainly head over to our Patreon website and do that. We also have some cool new-ish merch on our website, so check that out. It's new, I guess. It's been up for like a month now. I guess the last thing to make mention here, as we have been over the last couple episodes, is that we are hosting a retreat in New York in July that we're really excited for. All 5 of us from the podcast will be there. It will be July 23rd through 25th. As it's called As It Is in Heaven, Living the Christian Life. I believe that's what it's called. I don't have it right in front of me. But if you're looking for an in-person retreat this summer by a handful of Dominicans from Godsplaining, this might be something worth checking out. So until next time, know of our prayers. Please pray for us and take care.
Thanks for listening to Godsplaining, a work of the Dominican friars of the province of St. Joseph. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Leave a review on your podcast app. And visit us at godsplaining.org.